This is episode 24, the end of the French Revolution. Finally. And yes, end is in quotation marks because this revolution did not end neatly. Entire books, dozens really, have been written on when exactly the French Revolution ended. There's no exact date to tie it up in a pretty little bow, and this episode will help you understand why. Let's begin.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Robespierre and his followers have had their heads lopped off on July 28th by guillotine. But was the Reign of Terror over? I know I said it was at the tail of the last episode, and I'm not going to backtrack, I'm still correct, but it does depend on how you look at it, primarily because more people will die by execution in France. Before I start striding too far ahead though, allow me to pick up where I left off. Robespierre is dead, over 50 of his followers and several other leading members of the Committee of Public Safety were executed as well. So effectively, the head has been sliced off the snake with their deaths. The snake being the extremely powerful Committee of Public Safety, and primarily Robespierre himself, of course. And this was all done on the authority of the National Convention. The tide of extreme radicalism was halted, and in August the laws of the terror began to be repealed. On the 1st, the law of 22 Prairial was repealed, and on the 11th, the Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its executive powers as well. Furthermore, the leading members of the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris were arrested as well. With all this, the pendulum of society and politics swung to conservatism and anti-radicalism. Well, that's the traditional narrative anyways. Yes, the traditional narrative says that after the fall of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, everyone in France turned against radicalism and the perpetrators of terror. That is not entirely a lie, but is certainly not the truth. And I cannot possibly let such a half-truth slip through. The truth is, the Reign of Terror was essentially over. But the National Convention was still extremely radical. This was the same convention with the same members that had held hands with the Committee of Public Safety and the Paris Commune throughout the Reign of Terror. Heck, Barrière, the man who said, quote, "Terror is the order of the day," the previous year, was still a leading member of the convention. Granted, the convention in August and September was less radical than it had been before, certainly, and many members of the convention slammed the Jacobins and the radicals like a man named Talleyrand, but neither of these points can deny the fact that the convention was still radicalized. For example, on September 4th, the National Convention declared that Mirabeau, you remember him, right? Well, they declared that Mirabeau's body should be removed from the Paris Pantheon to be replaced by that of Jean-Paul Marat's. And thanks to this, Mirabeau's bones have yet to be identified, and most likely never will be. So if that is an extreme political radicalism, well, I guess I don't know what is. In spite of this, the people of France, even Paris itself, felt entirely different. Not indifferent, different. They were no longer radical. Now they were the exact opposite. And after thousands of French people were released from prison in August, 3,500 alone in Paris, many of them wanted vengeance against the Jacobins or anyone even remotely related to the Jacobin ideology. Vengeance for being wrongfully imprisoned, or vengeance for lost loved ones who had been massacred during the terror. Others, at the very least, were bitter about how the Jacobins had disgraced their entire nation. So it was that in early September, the people called for 6 radical delegates of the convention to be indicted. But the convention refused, and the Jacobin Club even had the audacity to expel Jean Lambert, Talleyrand, and Louis-Marie Fréron from their ranks. And this moment was truly the beginning of the end for the Jacobins. And both Talleyrand and Fréron would become leaders of a group known as the Thermidorians. And what came next is known as the Thermidorian reaction. The Thermidorian reaction is when Paris, and then the rest of France, turned entirely against the Jacobins. And what, you ask, is a Thermidorian? A Thermidorian is a member of a political group that broke off of the mountain in August. And by 1795, they had become known as Thermidorians. They got their name from the month of Thermidor, which is analogous to July. And they used that month because that was the month, of course, that Robespierre was overthrown. So, moving on, this Thermidorian reaction began in earnest in mid-September 1794, after Talleyrand and Fréron were evicted from the Jacobins. The Thermidorians, supported by the people of Paris, formed a political campaign against the Jacobins. They painted the Jacobins as the perpetrators of the Reign of Terror and the supporters of the tyrant dictator Robespierre. And the propaganda stuck because the people were sick of the radicalism of the Jacobins. The historian William Doyle even says that by October, quote, the term Jacobin became one of general opprobrium, associated indelibly with terror, end quote. The Thermidorians then released information about the atrocities that had occurred in the provinces, especially about the drownings in Nantes, as they continued to rail against everything Jacobin. And this political smear campaign worked beautifully, for even the National Convention was pressured to agree with the Thermidorians and the people of Paris. The provinces of France too pushed back against the Jacobins, with most provinces shutting down their revolutionary tribunals during the fall. And in November, a policeman even reported, quote, it was enough simply to have the look of a Jacobin to be called after, insulted, and even beat up, end quote. So it was that the National Convention, under immense popular pressure, declared on November 12th that all Jacobin clubs were to be closed for good. Going further still, 70-some-odd Girondins were reinstated by November as well, but as the new year approached, the Thermidorian reaction was just picking up steam. Before I get to that, though, I have to at least mention the French economy. It was still in a miserable state. The currency had continued to deflate throughout 1794, and the maximum price laws were no longer working. Economic reports and personal accounts during late 1794 also suggest that people were now entirely ignoring the price restrictions, and almost every product was selling far above the maximum. In an effort to reverse these trends, the National Convention repealed the maximum price laws on December 24th in hopes that a return to a free market would restore stability and prosperity. Yet, the winter of 1794-95 had something else in mind. People that study historical weather patterns and stuff like that even say that the winter was the worst Europe suffered during the entire 18th century, narrowly beating out the horrendous winter of 1788, the one I went in depth about during episode 5, I believe. And during this winter, the rivers went into a snap freeze and stayed frozen solid until April and May. And the reason I say this is because it prevented grain from being shipped throughout France by waterways. This stifled the economy, or at least stalemated it, but more importantly, it made famine a very real threat once more. Another reason this winter was arguably worse as well is because there was still a war going on. Yeah, remember that old thing? Due to this, the army was draining supplies, and they were also the first to get grain before everyone else in France. This led to several food riots in the spring of 1795, but while food was short and of poor quality, France was still able to suffer its way through the winter of 1795 by the skin of their teeth. Beyond food struggles, the winter continued to bring on change as the Thermidorian reaction continued to pick up speed. People wanted everything the despicable Jacobins had done to be struck from the records and the law books. Laws against emigre were lifted, Marat's body was removed from the Pantheon, the constitutional church was dismantled, and finally the cult of the Supreme Being was officially dissolved as well. Along those same lines, a campaign was beginning to coalesce advocating for the dissolution of the Republic. These rumors were quiet, but they were beginning to gain momentum during March and April of 1795. By that time, though, the Thermidorian reaction began to finally turn violent. And this violent period that followed is known as the White Terror, or the White Purge, but it was nowhere near the intensity of the previous acts during the Reign of Terror. The White Terror was nevertheless very violent. Tens of thousands of people would end up being imprisoned throughout the country, and the number of people actually killed is uncertain. The general consensus puts the number of victims above 3,000 over the course of 1795 as a whole. This occurred primarily in the form of guillotine execution and lynches by counter-revolutionary mobs. However, I cannot linger on the White Purge because there was much more happening as the summer approached in 1795. The food shortage crisis was horrifying by May, and I have to mention the war that France was still in. I'll start with the War of the First Coalition. Almost all conflict in the war had ground to a halt by late 1794, and the National Convention had been conducting peace talks since the beginning of 1795 in an effort to bring the war to a close. By late April, their efforts had drawn fruit. Peace treaties were signed with Spain, Holland, and Prussia, and talks were in the works with Austria and Britain. But all you need to know about the war at this point is that it had slowed down to a general ceasefire. It wasn't over, new warfare would break out, but not until after 1795. The people of France weren't much paying attention to this though, because they were bordering on starvation. In Paris, for example, they were surviving on a ration of 2 ounces of bread a day during the month of May. Famine seemed to be only days away, and as you now know, when famine is close, the people are very, very irritable, to say the least. The people wanted a new government that was capable of providing a stable food supply. But the people of Paris were not entirely decided on what kind of government they wanted. Thousands marched calling for the Constitution of 1793 to be restored, and thousands more called for a new constitution. And some even called for a restoration of the monarchy under the 10-year-old Louis XVII. The last option, though, proved impossible, because in early June 1795, the young Dauphin Louis XVII died of some sort of lymph node infection. Yet something had to change in the French government, and even the National Convention was aware of this, and the debate for a new constitution began in the summer of 1795. This time of discussion became known as the Thermidorian Convention. And during these talks, a Thermidorian by the name of d'Anglas argued for the interest of property owners when he said, quote, "Finally, the happy hour has arrived when, ceasing to be the gladiators of liberty, we can be its true founders. I no longer see in this assembly the villains who tarnished it. The archways of this temple no longer echo with their bloody vociferation, with their treacherous propositions. Our deliberations are no longer chained by the tyranny of the committeemen. They will no longer be led astray by the demagogy of their accomplices. You must offer to the French nation a republican constitution that ensures its independence. You must, with its eminent establishment, finally guarantee the property of the rich man, the existence of the pauper, the enjoyment of the industrious man, the freedom and safety of all. We should be governed by the best among us. The best are the most learned and those most interested in maintaining the law. A country governed by property owners is the social order." End quote. Language such as this was frequent, but many delegates had far different ideas, which is what caused the constitutional talks to continue for 3 months. And when the delegates finally did decide, they came up with a system different from anything they'd tried as of yet. And the Constitution of 1795 was passed in the convention on August 22nd, 1795, and was distributed to be ratified by the people of France. So, what was this new system? Well, it has become known as the Directory, or the Directorate. It was a very conservative governmental design with a bicameral legislation with a grand total of 750 members. The first legislative body was the Council of 500, and the other 250 delegates served in the Council of the Ancients, which is sometimes known as the Council of Elders. And the executive body of this new French government was the Directory, which was made up of 5 directors chosen by the Council of Ancients. And the directors proved to have immense power over French policy and affairs, and the French Directorate governed France until 1799, when it was replaced by the French Consulate under General Napoleon Bonaparte. Thus, the Thermidorian reaction ended when the Constitution of 1795 was ratified in late September, and the 4-year reign of the French Directorate began immediately after. That is where my history of the First French Revolution concludes, but I have one final historical quandary to address. It's a question I have avoided thus far as I've made my way through the French Revolution because it's a very large, very important question. The question, of course, is, how influential was the French Revolution? The short answer is, very. So if you want to take your ball and go home now, you can. But the full answer is much more complex. And while I understand the importance of this question, I do think it is a highly overrated question. I say overrated because it is overused and really it's impossible to fully answer. That being said, I'm not going to hammer you with a half-hour monologue on why the revolution was important. And I'm sure you've already thought of your own opinions already. I'll try and narrow my answer down to a 2-minute drill. Now, before I begin my little 2-minute monologue, when I was forming my opinion and answer on how impactful and influential the French Revolution was, I looked at many sources, of course. But when I was looking at works by non-professionals in this historic field, I ran across a trend of misconceptions. I have seen it stated that this revolution, quote, signaled the victory of democracy over tyranny, end quote. That is just blatantly false, or wishful thinking at the best. France, nor most of Europe, was governed by tyrants. Kings and queens are not analogous with tyrants, and besides, democracy did not win out in this revolution. Democracy was never even attempted, and for those that disagree, allow me to define democracy for you, because the word is often misconstrued in our modern society. Democracy comes from two ancient Greek words, demos, which means the people, and krati or kratia, which means power or rule by. Therefore, democracy means rule by the people, which means that every single citizen participates equally in government. Sounds terrifying, doesn't it? Well, so did the French, which is why they didn't even try it. So no, this revolution was not a victory of democracy over tyranny. Really, it was a rapid transfer of power from one group to the next until it ended up in the hands of Napoleon for about 16 years. Another misconception I keep seeing is that people think that this is the revolution that Les Miserables was set in. It's not. That's a novel that took place during the July Revolution and the June Rebellion, 1830 and 1832 respectively. There's a lot of other misconceptions, but they're mainly trivial ones. So anyways, let me start answering this question now. I began by reminding you that the First French Revolution was really a failure. The people had wanted more prosperity and more say in the government. Primarily, they wanted less oppression from the nobles and clergy, but they certainly didn't want a democracy or a republic. The closest this revolution got to succeeding in this convoluted purpose was the Constitution of 1791, but that had quickly collapsed. Here, I'll even list out the failures that come to mind. The old regime had fallen. The constitutional monarchy under the national and legislative assemblies had failed. The king and queen had been executed. The republic and the convention had failed. Rebellion had broken out. Hundreds of thousands of people had died in a self-inflicted reign of terror. Thousands more had died in a confusing continental war, and the Directorate failed too when Napoleon formed the consulate and later his French Empire. So in almost every sense, this revolution was a spectacular failure. But I will admit that depends on your definition of failure. Nevertheless, these so-called failures were incredibly important. The French Revolution, through its violent experimentation, thrust the Western world into what many now refer to as the modern world. It ushered in the all-important Napoleonic Wars, forced economic reorganization, and paved the way for nationalism. Yes, the French Revolution gave Napoleon the opportunity to rise, and the Napoleonic Wars that followed redefined what warfare and strategy meant in the rapidly modernizing world. The revolution also exposed the fragile state of economies and left the door open for the Industrial Revolution to completely change the societies and economies of the world. Lastly, the French Revolution planted the roots of nationalism throughout Europe. Nationalism is the distinct idea where citizens are uniquely attached to their nations. They do not see themselves as farmers or merchants loyal to a king or something of the sort. No, these citizens have patriotic sentiment that inspires them to see themselves as Frenchmen or Englishmen, Italian, whatever it may be. And unlike today, that was a very new idea that the French Revolution forced Europe to consider. This consideration led to the formation of modern nation-states as we know them, and this led to great societal change across Europe as Italy, Germany, and many other states unified into single nations after overthrowing their respective monarchies. Indeed, it is important to remind ourselves that the Europe we know today and the way the West has developed in the modern world was molded by nationalistic thinking, and such thinking began in France, and that is why the French Revolution of 1789 is so important. Alright, that concludes the Everything History podcast telling of the French Revolution. I will be tackling the English Revolution of 1688 next, and that will start 2 weeks from the release of this episode. But, if I get enough questions on the French Revolution from you guys and gals, I'll do an episode entirely answering your questions before I begin the English Revolution of 1688. So send them my way at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.